And now let me introduce James with this short bio. James Stevenson is an extension specialist with the University of Florida, IFAS, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension Services in Pinellas County. He works out of the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center in Tarpon Springs. James teaches classes on a variety of natural resource conservation topics, including plant identification, botany, entomology, ecology, and particular groups of native plants such as ferns, wetland wildflowers, and epiphytes. And now it's my distinct pleasure to turn the program over to you, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know the subject might not catch a lot of people's attention if they saw it advertised, so good for you for tuning in. We're going to explore a very fascinating group of plants that are not related to each other. What they share is actually a lifestyle. As Joni mentioned, I work for the Extension Services. Just a reminder, if you're new to hearing about extension, we are an extension of the University of Florida right here in Pinellas County. And we provide free information to the citizens in our county. We're not selling anything. We're probably best known for our garden advice, but we also provide information on wildlife, interacting with and living alongside in harmony with wildlife, natural resource conservation, which is why our education centers, Brooker Creek and Weeden Island, even exist. We also help people, perhaps you've heard of home economics. That's also a branch of Extension Services. It's now called Families and Consumer Sciences. So all things that have to do with running a very efficient home, as it were. And of course, 4-H is an extension of the UF IFAS. So empowering the youth to come up being good citizens of our county. If you need to get in touch in future, if there's anything that you would like to go over again, please do take down my email address. It's my job to interact with the public, and that's you. So if you do have any questions, comments, or complaints, or ideas, or any issues whatsoever, always feel free to reach out. If you haven't been to our preserve up here in Tarpon Springs, we're kind of the complement to Weeden Island, where Weeden Island is a conservation area for our coastal habitats. Brooker Creek is our freshwater wetlands and upland dry land plants and animals. So we have completely different ecosystems up here, and 8,000 acres of which. So today's topic is epiphytes. Perhaps you saw when you registered what that means, the air plants. The epiphytes are is kind of a non-scientific grouping. These plants are not related, but they share a lifestyle. They live on other plants, in particular trees or other large perennial plants, those plants that live from year to year to year. But really, when we're talking about epiphytes, we're talking about plants that live on the trunks and branches of trees. Now, it's very important, and I'm going to say this a billion times, well, not that many times, but quite a few times. These plants and other organisms that we'll look at today are not parasites. Not one single organism that we're going to look at today does any harm whatsoever to the plant where it grows. Epiphytes use their roots to hang on. They don't use their roots to suck anybody's blood or do any harm. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to repeat this over and over again. There's a lot of misunderstanding, which is one of the reasons that this whole presentation was put together. I have an example, not necessarily an example, but this underscores this whole idea. Here we have a collection of epiphytic organisms, both plants and lichen and others, growing on a plastic-coated metal fence. No parasitism. Will you believe me now? These organisms are not parasitic on the plastic or the metal. It can't be done. They're simply using their roots and other structures to hang on tight. Epiphytism is a lifestyle. It's a way of living. Here we have a tree, which might not look unfamiliar to people who live in Florida, central and southern Florida, a live oak tree. And the branches, these nice horizontal branches, the tree has grown these wonderful horizontal branches for itself to present its own leaves as efficiently as possible to the sunlight. So here's a tree that has grown a horizontal branch in almost all directions in order to display its leaves as best as possible to the most available sunlight. On those horizontal branches have taken root from an external seed source, or in the case of the ferns, from spores blowing in. An external source of propagules have all flown in, literally, and landed on these horizontal branches and taken hold, taken root, germinated, and grown into full-size, reproductive-sized plants. And so all of these branches on this live oak are now covered in epiphytic growth. So the oak tree is the phyte, is the plant that all these things are growing on. And as I mentioned, we have a collection of orchids, we have ferns, we have bromeliads, which are the three groups of plants that are best represented in Florida and the ones that we'll go over today. This lifestyle evolved across several different groups of plants, both flowering plants and non-flowering plants like ferns. It's popped up several times because it solves several critical plant survival problems. One of those problems is limited space. If you look at even this photograph of the live oak growing in an upland with the saw palm meadows, the cabbage palms trying to come up in the shade of this oak tree. It's rather crowded on the forest floor here. These smaller plants need some real estate, and that real estate is really the only free real estate that's available are these bare tree branches. So in a crowded forest situation where all these plants are vying for the same limited space, at least 3 plant groups in particular evolved separately to take advantage of that free real estate and have adapted to living on the tree branches. Another limitation is the limited light that's going to come through that oak canopy and the canopy of all the other surrounding trees. So again, these 3 very different groups of plants have evolved to live on the tree branches where they're that much closer to the sun. They're that much better positioned, just that tiny little bit better positioned to have that little bit more access to sunlight that allows them to outcompete and to get old enough to reproduce, because that's why anything lives, apparently. So epiphytism, or living as an epiphyte, solves the problem or addresses the problem of limited access to light. And finally, epiphytes have to cope with the fact that now their roots are no longer in the soil. So there's no way of drawing water out of the soil using the roots. So in order to live as an epiphyte, all these different disparate plants have to have figured out a way to get enough water to live out of the air, giving them their name air plants. So problems presented, problems solved. All these plants have adapted to life in the tree tops. Here's an example of what looks like some hungry sea urchins climbing a tree. Well, that's not what's happening. This is a species of epiphyte, one of the air plants, one of the bromeliads. That might be a group that you've heard of before. This is the southern needleleaf, and it has ticked all the boxes of life as an epiphyte. It's using its roots to hang on tight. It's not getting any water or nutrition or any sustenance from that red maple tree. It's just hanging on. It's not a parasite. Does that sound familiar? I'm going to say it. I'm telling you, they're not doing any harm to their host. Harming the host would kill the host and bring the host crashing to the ground. And then these epiphytic plants would lose access to light, real estate, because now they're on the ground and everything else is growing over the top of them. And everything on top is going to prevent any water from reaching. So they're going to lose all their access to everything. If the epiphytes were ever to harm their host, it would be game over for the epiphytes. There's nothing in it for the epiphytes to do any harm whatsoever to the host. These plants in particular, these southern needleleaves, also have to adapt to the fact that this red maple loses its leaves in the winter. Many of our trees are evergreen, but the red maple, which has a distribution all the way up into Maine and Canada, where of course they have cold winters where everything loses its leaves for that reason. Here in the close to southern hemisphere, our red maples lose their leaves during the dry season. So it's the same kind of cycle, but the epiphytes have to adapt to that as well. And these plants are showing that they've put on kind of a sunscreen. They have produced a lot more red pigment that acts as a sunscreen now that the sunlight in the winter isn't coming through the maple leaves anymore. They're just kind of way out in the open. So they're getting a little bit more sunlight than they probably can use efficiently. So this red pigment moves in. So here's just an example of all the different adaptations of how these plants have adjusted to life in the treetops. So the three main groups of plants that we are going to look at today are the orchids. Orchids are the most diverse of one of the two main branches of the flowering plants. There's two main branches of flowering plants, and the orchids are the most speciated, the most diverse. There are more orchids than many other flowering plant groups. There's 20,000 different orchids. That's a lot of orchids. 75, 73, something like that, 73% of orchids, of all those thousands of species, are epiphytic. So orchids have this sussed out. The bromeliads are another group of flowering plants. They're on the same branch as the orchids. They're not quite as diverse, but again, primarily epiphytic. Bromeliad's center of evolution is in Central and South America. Lots of jungles, lots of competition for real estate, evolving life up in the treetops, and in especially the rainforest situation has led to a great diversity within this group, the bromeliads. And the ferns, another group of plants. This, of course, ferns are not flowering plants. They belong to a third branch of the tree of plant life on Earth. Ferns, of course, predate in the fossil record all the flowering plants. The ferns represent some of the earliest of the land plants. And ferns, once trees came along, ferns with their very dust-like spores that can reach anywhere, also adapted an epiphytic lifestyle. So living with their roots hanging on to this new free real estate. There are plants, of course, and this group of organisms called lichen, which grow epiphytically and are found very often on tree trunks. They're actually a combination of several different organisms. There's plants in there, there's fungus in there, there's bacteria in there, there's yeast in there, there's all kinds of things all going on at the same time. But these multifaceted organisms also will grow epiphytically on trees, but they're not quite as particular. They'll grow on anything. They'll grow on any bare surface. So it's not that they depend on the surface of trees to grab hold of. These things will grow on bare rocks as well. Some of these epiphytes will grow on bare rocks, but we don't have any bare rocks, do we? Naturally. We're not a rocky peninsula. We're a sandy peninsula. We don't have any stones for these things to take take hold of. So we'll look at some lichens. We won't get too esoteric. We'll focus mainly on these three main groups of plants, including, we'll start with the orchids. I'm going to go ahead and check in with everyone, make sure you're okay. Is it red because it's on a maple tree? Let's go. The southern needleleaf was growing on the red maple tree. Just a coincidence that the needleleaf that turns red in the winter happened to be growing on that red maple. The two rednesses don't have anything to do with each other. Red maple is a great place for epiphytes to live because the bark is very smooth. Yes, all of today's epiphytes are not only found in Florida, they're found in Pinellas County. So all the plants that we're going to look at today, you can visit Weeden Island, Brooker Creek, or any other of our natural areas that haven't been too overdeveloped, and you can see these very species. Southern needleleaf, that's right. Thanks for continuing with your questions. And we'll continue with today's presentation with orchids. He said, pressing go. Here we go. The Florida butterfly orchid. This is a very widespread orchid. This one you can actually buy. Thankfully, this one isn't as widely collected out of nature and resold. This is a species that has been cultivated for so long, and improvements have been made. Larger flower colors, deeper color, fragrance, all these things have been kind of manipulated and cloned so you can purchase these plants that have not been wild collected. Many different color forms, and it's named after our very own Tampa Bay. This is Encyclia tampensis. You can see the variable colors within the species, kind of a brownish orange petal color, and then it's got this wonderful landing pad for the pollinators to identify where the nectar is going to be found. If the pollinator can find that orange spot and start heading in this direction, the orchid plants a little pollen sac right on the pollinator's back. When it visits another flower, it transfers that pollen, and so on. You can see these plants hanging on in the background, using their roots to cling to the tree bark, but not to parasitize. These plants have green leaves. They're perfectly capable of producing their own sugars through photosynthesis. After flowering, these plants, like all flowering plants, they produce a fruit. Now, it's not a fruit that we can eat. There's a botanical definition of fruit, and there's a nutritionist definition of fruit. The botanical definition of fruit is what happens after a plant flowers. And the flowers are pollinated, and the seeds begin to develop, and they have to develop inside of something, and that something is always referred to as a fruit. So here we have our Tampa butterfly orchid, or our Florida butterfly orchid, after it's flowered, and the fruit is developing. And in orchids, especially those epiphytic species, the seeds are as small as dust. They're very, very, very specialized, maybe only a few cells, so that when these pods ripen, when this fruit ripens, you might relate to it better if I say seed pod instead of fruit. When these ripen, they'll split along 6 little seams that these pods are made of, and the dust is released in the air. And you can see how that favors this epiphytic lifestyle, in that the seeds are just going to drift through the air and land on the branch of another tree and take root and begin to grow into another generation of orchids. So Encyclia tampensis, our Florida butterfly orchid, very widespread. It has been over collected in the past, but you can still go places and visit it. Brooker Creek is a great place to see this one in flower in June. So next month, our horizontal branches out here, especially directly over the creek, where the humidity is very high. We'll address that in just a second, are good places to find this. There are huge colonies of this orchid growing at Hammock. I'm going to get this wrong. I'll come back to it later. Over by Kapok Tree. What's that one called? What is that? Anyway, I'll think of it. In Pinellas County, you can find this native orchid growing epiphytically. An orchid that only perhaps a mother could love. This is one of our ghost orchids, the Dendrophylax orchids. Of course, the ghost orchid gets all the attention and gets to be on the cover of, National Geographic magazine. This is a slightly more humble version of the ghost orchid. This one is probably mosquito or gnat, G-N-A-T, gnat pollinated. A very, very, very small flower for a very small pollinator. You can just see here the little bells and the hugely oversized seed pods or fruit. These are called ghost orchids because they seem to pop out of nowhere. They do not produce leaves. An even more specialized lifestyle. Here's a full-grown adult flowering sized ghost orchid, or jingle bell orchid is one of its common names, Dendrophylax. And for scale, and this is the first one that we found for proof that we actually saw it, that's your presenter, creepy in the background, observing this plant from the ground. So this one wasn't too high in the trees. But what you see here is a mass of those modified roots that aren't parasitizing the tree. They're just hanging on. And they're hanging on for, literally dear life. And in the absence of leaves, this plant does not produce leaves on purpose, naturally. That's how it is. Not this individual, this species doesn't produce leaves. Instead, all the photosynthesis is carried out through the roots themselves. And orchid roots, especially epiphytic orchid roots, are covered in a special layer of cells. And that layer is referred to as the velamen because it's velvety. Not only is it able to cling to the surface where it's growing, in this case, a small oak tree, but it is also quite spongy. And so it can absorb rainfall. It can absorb humidity. So very, very efficient at gaining, retaining, and using a limited amount of rainfall during the rainy season. And the roots also are full of chlorophyll, which is normally sequestered into plant leaves. Here, this orchid, clever thing, has evolved so it only has to produce these roots. It saves on water consumption. If you think of it, it doesn't produce great big leaves that are going to lose a lot of water through evaporation and transpiration. So very efficient, very well adapted to wet and dry seasons like we have here, often overlooked. And here you can see it's just beginning growth. This is a picture taken in the spring. It is growing amongst a different plant altogether this kind of shaggy looking business that is also occupying the bark and also trying to, if you'll look closely, it's actually trying to grow over the top of the orchid here. So the orchid's going to have to outgrow this other plant, which is called a liverwort. It's an ugly name. I didn't make it up, but that's just what it's called. After flowering, the ghost orchid again produces these crazy oversized seed pods, these capsules that will eventually split open and release the seeds. And that's all we've got for orchids. We've got about a dozen different orchids that are native to Pinellas County, but only 2 that we have in the county are epiphytic. Many, many more epiphytic species the further south you go. Once you get into a more tropical environment where the epiphytes can absorb a lot more rainwater through that velamen on their roots, where forests are more continuously humid throughout the year so that these epiphytic orchids can absorb throughout the year. So again, this huge group of flowering plants, the orchids, 75% are epiphytic. But here in Pinellas County, only 2% are epiphytic. So let's move on to the next group of plants, the bromeliads. And this might be a group of plants that you've heard of before. The bromeliads are probably best represented by the spokes bromeliad, the pineapple. And in Florida, we are also more likely to, or as likely to, associate bromeliads with ornamental plants, with landscape plants even, because we can leave a lot of these species outdoors in our mild climate. The most popular house plant is in fact a bromeliad. And those same adaptations that have allowed these plants to survive living on the branches of trees, where they can be very efficient with water and they can be very efficient in low light, has led them to be very popular houseplants, because that's one thing that we can certainly provide: not enough water and not enough light. And these plants are pre-adapted for that kind of abuse. Orchids, nope. Where are we talking about? Bromeliads. This group is the center of evolution is in Central and South America. So the proto-bromeliads began kind of around in this area, and everything worked out great, so good, expanded, diversified over millions of years, and they're almost only found around that center of evolution, where the proto-bromeliad originated and then spread all the way up into North America. This is the extent of Spanish moss, which is a bromeliad, and then a huge, of course, diversity in South America, in the rainforest there. But there's also this weird adjunct distribution in Africa. There's one species of bromeliad that occurs in Africa. And there's several theories about why we have, how did plants that originated in South America get to Africa? There's all kind of wonderful theories. Some bear a lot more weight than others, and you're perfectly justified in having your own if you want to make one up. Perhaps the most widely accepted is that the continents of South America and Africa were much closer to one another. You can kind of see where this part of Africa fits quite nicely in this part of South America. They were actually connected at one time. And around the time that the continents were beginning to drift apart is when the distribution, the diversification of the bromeliads was taking place. And since their seeds, remember, the epiphyte seeds fly because they have to get from branch to branch, it's very likely that over thousands and thousands and thousands of years of weather patterns, the cyclones and hurricanes would actually blow from west to east when these two continents were closer to one another. It's very possible that some of that seed material traveled to a new continent by the air and were able to get established naturally in Africa. Bromeliads are associated with a group of birds that also, whose center of evolution is also Central and South America, the hummingbirds. And so a lot of bromeliads have flowers that are adapted to being pollinated by this group. This isn't one of our native hummingbirds, but you get the idea. The hummingbird, the bromeliad, true love always, right? These are the 8 different species of bromeliad that are naturally found in Pinellas County. What you'll notice is they're all in the same genus. Now, this is a very large family, the bromeliads. There's a whole lot of different genera, but in Pinellas County, we only have the diversity within one single genus, and that genus is called Tillandsia. And I bet if you practiced, you could probably say Tillandsia and not be afraid of it, even if you got to genus level. And you'd be right. All of our wild air plants are in the same genus, Tillandsia. The northern needleleaf, Bartram's air plant, wild pine, ball moss, southern needleleaf, the Florida air plant, Spanish moss, and the giant air plant. In alphabetical order, these are the 8 species that have been vouchered in Pinellas County. We'll start with the one that everybody knows, even your non-planty friends. Tillandsia, the genus, right? Usneoides, which means just like a beard. So Tillandsia usneoides is the Tillandsia that looks just like a beard. That's how you translate these scientific names. It's known as Spanish moss, but you know, and you better know from today on, that it's not Spanish and it's not a moss. It's a Southeast US and Caribbean bromeliad, but that's too much of a mouthful. You can still call it Spanish moss, but mean a flowering plant that's a bromeliad. Here's a flower of the Spanish moss. It's not grown for its flowers, obviously. They're very small. Again, their pollinator is probably an itty-bitty little moth or something that you wouldn't really notice. But once the flowers pollinated, remember what happened in the orchids? Once the flowers are pollinated, the seeds have to develop inside something. Well, that thing that the seeds develop inside is called a fruit. And the fruit of the Spanish moss, yes, there is, represented right here with its 3 little fins where the seed pods split along those 3 lines to release the flying seeds. So here we have Spanish moss. The flower is long gone. It's been pollinated. The seed pod ripened, and here are the little torpedo-shaped seeds ready to launch out of that seed pod and fly through the air on these little hairs that are going to act like parachutes and let that Spanish moss seed sail to the next tree. Remember when I said at the beginning that none of these plants are parasites? Remember when I said at the beginning that none of these plants harm the tree that they're living in? I meant it. It's true. Spanish moss never harms the host. Ball moss, tambien. Ball moss, another Tillandsia, different growth form. Instead of growing in these ever-lengthening festoons of this lacy foliage, the ball moss kind of curls in on itself. This one actually still has roots. Spanish moss has foregone roots altogether. It just hangs there, leaf after leaf after leaf. The ball moss actually has a little bit of root system that it uses to hang on, nothing more. No plumbing, no parasitizing, nothing like that. And the leaves kind of come out in a recurved fashion. So this is Tillandsia recurvata, and the recurvata refers to the way that the leaves kind of grow out and then back in and forms this ball shape. The flowers on ball moss are produced on these long stems, these long stalks. So they're kind of held out to where perhaps a hummingbird, perhaps a different kind of moth some other pollinator is going to find them. So the pollinators don't have to get up and in it like they do in the Spanish moths. Ball moss is one of the species of Tillandsia that you will very likely see growing on a power wire or a telephone wire. Again, underscoring that these plants are not parasitic. They're not doing any harm to the host. They're covered in scales. And the scales, they're not leaves. The scales are an extension of the leaf surface. Each one of these kind of tubular structures represent individual leaves. They're kind of curled in on themselves. Those are the photosynthetic surfaces, which then are covered in these scales that increase the surface area significantly, and they increase the absorptiveness, if that's a word, absorptivity. They can absorb the rainwater. They can absorb humidity. They can grab moisture out of the air for those plants to use. So the scaly leaf surfaces of the ball moss and the Spanish moss. Southern needleleaf, they have a little bit more structure. So not only do they have scales on their leaves, but their needle-shaped leaves are clustered at the base. So they actually form kind of a living sponge that water can actually be held just osmotically amongst themselves in each one of these little bundles. Each one of these is an independent plant that started from a single seed and then just got older and older and older. Tillandsia, again, the genus. Cetacea means bristly. So this is the southern needleleaf, the bristly Tillandsia. Here we have two next to each other here at Brooker Creek, again, growing on a red maple with its smooth bark, not harming the tree, just hanging out or hanging on. The southern needleleaf here in the winter with its red pigmentation. And our next subject, the Florida air plant, Tillandsia simulata. And simulata means the Tillandsia that looks like something else. And we'll see just what that something else is in a second. You can see perhaps the familial resemblance that makes this a bromeliad. The things that make this a unique bromeliad are the way that it holds these kind of medium-sized leaves. They're very much longer than the other species that we've seen before. When it does go into flower, the entire stalk that's going to bear the flowers is red pigmented, probably trying to draw in some sort of pollinator that's attracted to the color red. This is the only, as I said before, simulata means that it looks like something else. And this is the only bromeliad species that is only found in Florida. All these other species are found in other places. Spanish moss and ball moss you can find up in Georgia. Spanish moss you can find up in South Carolina, even down into the Caribbean. But Tillandsia simulata is only found in Florida. Its only distribution is Florida, making it one of our very own. The flowers themselves, a little bit more showy than the Spanish moss flowers. You'll recall those were small and green. These are longer. They form more of a tube. They're purple. Again, they might be attracting something that's attracted to red. When they're fully open, you can see they stick their little pollen brushes out into the world, and they keep their nectar hidden down in a little tank towards the base of the flower, just perfectly matched to the size and shape of a hummingbird, so that when hummingbirds visit these plants, the plants will dust their foreheads with pollen. Unbeknownst to the bird, then flies to another flower and transfers the pollen, facilitating pollination, fertilization of the egg cells. And remember what happens after it flowers? The fruit forms. Even if that fruit is a dried pod, it's still referred to as a fruit. So here's the Florida air plant seed pod or fruit. splitting open and releasing, just like the Spanish moss and the ball moss. These seeds that are equipped with wings. There you can see the little pointy seed that's going to be just configured just right to wedge down into the space between some bark flakes. These are the species that you're going to see the most. These are the most widely distributed in the county, the ones that can tolerate the most pollution, and the ones that are least affected by the bad news. The bad news is an introduced pest species of beetle, a group within the beetles known as the weevils. They're plant pests. In nature, they have checks and balances. The Mexican Bromeliad weevil, also known as Metamasius, doesn't have any natural enemies here in Florida. It arrived in a shipment or several shipments or shipments over many years of wild collected material where this plant is native in Mexico and Central and South America. They were hitchhikers. They came in as larvae and established. And their larvae, while the adults do feed on plant leaves, and they use this funny like beaky kind of mouth to pierce into plants and to suck some plant juice, but the real damage comes from their larvae. Beetle larvae are called grubs. You probably heard of grubs. Beetle larvae are grubs. They do quite a lot of feeding themselves. They have chewing mouth parts, and they're adapted to chewing the heart out of species of Bromeliad. Our native bromeliads, here's an example, the giant bromeliad that's been completely hollowed out. This is not an uncommon scene, unfortunately, where our native bromeliad species are growing, to find individuals that have fallen from the treetops because their heart, the heart of the plant, the epicenter, has been completely eaten away and severed from the roots. And no, sadly, they don't grow back. Especially the giant air plant, this is one and done. There are the problems with any kind of control to protect our native bromeliads from the spread of Metamasius is that it's still kind of a new thing. We're still learning about it and its life cycle. There is a native pest of the weevil, and you've heard of biological control, where you release one thing to eat the other thing, and as soon as you're sure that that one thing that you're going to release only eats the target pest, then it's a win. The natural pest of the weevil is a mosquito, and guess how easy it would be to get funding to research breeding mosquitoes to release. How about none? Plus the mosquitoes, they don't like to get too hot. So biological control of the Metamasius is highly unlikely. The following species have been affected by this and are becoming more and more hard, more and more difficult. It's becoming more difficult to find the following species. The northern needleleaf. This is one that I've seen in great abundance in the corkscrew swamp, where the reproductive rate, the climate, the humidity, all the factors converge to help this species outpace the arrival of the weevil. Here in Pinellas County, reproduction is a little bit slower. We have colder winters. We have all kind of things that are kind of, that already stunt the growth, as it were, of the species. So to recognize the northern needleleaf, you'll see these almost curlicue, almost corkscrew leaves, the most twisted of the bromeliads that are native here. They also are going to have the largest, it's called a cistern, actually, the leaf bases that overlap and form this water holding structure. You might be familiar, a lot of bromeliads can hold water. That's one of the adaptations to living in the treetops. You just have to make your own cistern, and that's what this section of some bromeliad species are called. They're not 100% necessary. Here you can see this plant has actually found itself upside down. So that cistern is not holding any water. The plant is still doing just fine. It's making it by on what it can absorb through the scales on its leaves. Bartram's air plant is the species that Simulata, the Florida air plant, this is what it's supposed to look like. If it was up to me, I wouldn't have chosen this one as the lookalike. I think this one looks a lot more like the needleleaf. I'm more likely to get Bartram and needleleaf confused, but it wasn't up to me. This one is named after someone called Bartram. Very narrow silver leaves. This one doesn't turn bright red in the winter. Same kind of red flowering stems, same tubular purple flowers as we've seen before on some of these other Tillandsia species. Here again, you can see the flowering stem with the little tubular purple flowers awaiting a pollinator. Here you can see last year's flowering stem and the ripening fruit that's going to bust open and release the seeds on wings. This one is more likely to grow in hemispherical clusters. It's kind of like a turtleneck around trees. It kind of grows in that fashion. Whereas the needleleaf will stay as a nice independent blob. Bartram's will tend to work its way as a collar. Another way to identify it, if it's important to you. The cardinal air plant is one of the larger of the Tillandsias. It's big, it's beautiful, it has wonderful flowers. It's been stolen a lot out of the wild for ornamental purposes. Again, how hard is it just to grab one of these things off the branches, stick it in a pot and run off? You've seen air plants for sale. That's where they come from. Rip, stick, go. It's a travesty. Anyway, the flowers presented in these multi-branched inflorescences. The bracts that are associated with the flowers are also colorful. You get yellows and pinks and purples all in the same inflorescence. This one's here at Brooker Creek. It's also got a big cistern that those Metamasius, the Mexican Bromeliad weevils, love to eat, sadly. The giant air plant, which we saw chewed up at Selby Gardens a few slides ago, lives up to its name. This one really does look like a giant pineapple up in the tree. This one lives for years and years and years. It can live up to like 10 years, depending on the conditions. And then it flowers and the whole thing dies. That's not unknown in the plant world, where a plant grows a certain number of years, like century plant has that reputation. But once it does flower, it really flowers and it really produces a lot of seeds. So each plant can produce up to 10,000 seeds, hoping against hope that some of those seeds are going to find a place to lodge, germinate, and grow into the next generation. They can look like the big, beautiful cardinal air plant, but the leaves are often more curvy, whereas the giant cardinal air plant, the leaves tend to stick much more upright, and they lack all the color in that inflorescence. But there are areas where you can see this quite widely. Information about these species from this book by Luther and Benzing. And it's a good place to mention that Selby Botanic Garden in Sarasota, their research area is epiphytes across all the plant families. And scientists, a pair of researchers there came up with this book called Native Bromeliads of Florida, where you can learn lots more genera that are more common south of here. And I'll take this opportunity in between subjects to address our Q&A. Question about the greenfly orchid, as maybe a third epiphytic species, hasn't been identified in Pinellas as far as I can tell. Much more common further north. I would love to see the greenfly orchid in Pinellas, but I'm not aware of it. Another epiphytic species, strangely, north of here, so we get more diversity of that. I'm gonna, so we get it that the plants aren't harming the tree. They're not taking anything from the tree, but could the epiphytes cause any damage to the tree? Like, could, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase this, could an epiphytic load, remember all those plants crowded on that horizontal live oak, could they maybe keep it too wet up there? The tree itself a healthy tree is going to be able to withstand an immense epiphyte load. A healthy tree is going to be able to withstand all that weight, all that water, everything. As soon as the tree becomes compromised for some other reason, it's getting old, it's got a disease, it's got struck by lightning and just got the wind knocked out of it, it's under attack from something else, it's otherwise got damaged, yes, the epiphytic load could overwhelm a weakened branch, but the tree would already be in decline. Also, all these epiphytes, all these bromeliads, they have a pace at which they grow. They have a growth rate. That growth rate is dependent on the climate, the amount of sunlight they're getting, just the growth rate of the species itself. So Spanish moss just gets this much bigger every season, this much bigger every year, this much bigger every month even. And a normal, healthy plant growing, a tree growing at its normal, healthy rate can keep a pace with that, can keep ahead of that. Again, once something comes in and compromises that tree and causes that tree's growth rate to decelerate or stop, the epiphytes are just going to keep growing at the pace that they're designed to grow. And eventually it's going to look like these things are smothering, I think is the word that nefarious landscapers use. Your tree is being smothered by these air plants. You need to pay me to take them off. No, I would perhaps pay someone to figure out why my tree is growing backwards. But the epiphytes are not smothering, because as soon as the smothering happens, if the net sum is that the epiphytes overtake and bring the tree to the ground, everyone's dead. So that's not good for anyone. So when does the Florida air plant flower? I can't quite tell. I know it's funny. It's late spring. It's like from now. I always want to catch it because I want to look for hummingbirds. And we do get hummingbirds every now and again, but it's obvious something else is pollinating them. I've taken pictures of Florida air plants in flower almost year round. So it's it just seems like it's up to them. I think the main flowering season is now, just ahead of the rainy season. So it can get those seeds out into the wind and established in the crook and the branches of a tree and the bark of a tree, so the rainy season can give them the water that they need. So right around now is a short answer. Monocarpic, which is the only monocarpic species, that means that it grows and flowers and fruits once and dies. Sorry about that. It's a monocarpic species, and it doesn't make pups. You've seen some plants, even bromeliads, that might grow and the central plant flowers and then that central plant dies, but it's left with some little clones around its base. The whole thing goes once it flowers in the giant air plant. The strangler fig as a representative of an epiphyte. The strangler fig is if you're familiar with strangler fig, this is a flowering plant. This is a tree that appears to it really does look like it grabs a hold. If you've seen this, it's quite dramatic, where it looks like it's like squeezing the life out of its host. A strangler fig is a representative of a hemi epiphyte, where the seed is planted in the droppings of a bird that ate the fig and then sat on another tree and pooped the fig seeds out. Those seeds germinated and spent part of its life, yes, as an epiphyte. But then one day the roots reach the ground, and then all heck breaks loose. Because as soon as those roots hit the ground, the growth rate skyrockets. And that fig then gets larger in all respects, eventually overshadowing and killing the tree where it germinated, because it wants the sunlight. What is the park over by K-Park? I can't. I promise I'll send it to you. It's got a huge butterfly orchid plant. Oh, heavens. I can't. What are some uses for these epiphytic plants? The sheer volume of Spanish moss led to its use among indigenous peoples, and following that, the settlers found use because it does grow so fast. It's relatively a renewable resource. You can tear a handful off, put it back on the tree, and it's going to grow into a huge curtain in a single season. Another one of the adaptations that Spanish moss has for life in the treetops is this extremely waterproof fiber that runs down the center of all those individual leaves. It's kind of like the stem that knits the whole thing together. And that fiber is extremely durable. The fiber was used as upholstery stuffing. The Spanish moss would be collected, would be soaked to rot all the outside leaves off and leave you with that water repellent central fiber. And then the fiber would be cleaned and dried and used to stuff all sorts of things. I think it was used to make saddle rugs. As I mentioned, it was used widely up until the 50s. There were Spanish moss processing plants in Florida. Unfortunately, some lazy people collected a bunch of Spanish moss off the forest floor, didn't treat it very well, and used it in upholstery. Those plants that were collected off the floor, nearby were some nest parasites, some arachnids known as red bugs, that were kind of bycatch. They were collected along with the Spanish moss. And those red bugs, which are blood-sucking arachnids, ended up in some upholstery. And ever since, Spanish moss has been associated with being full of bugs that are going to try and kill you. There's no bugs in Spanish moss. How are they ever going to get in touch with any blood by hanging in a tree? The insects are on the ground. The arachnids, the bloodsuckers, they're on the ground. It was unfortunate bycatch, as I said before. And ever since, the Spanish moss and the red bugs have been mentally intertwined, although A has nothing to do with B. We've seen Spanish moss and ball moss on the same tree. Are they symbiotic? Do they share a pollinator or a predatory bug? Ball moss, Spanish moss, they can tolerate a lot of the same environmental conditions. And so, yes, you're going to see them oftentimes associated with one another. They have the same dispersal mechanism, those airborne seeds. They like the same amount of sunlight, so they're going to find a place where they're going to get lots of nice bright sunlight. But as far as interacting with one another, they exist as separate entities. If anything, the Spanish moss has a slightly faster growth rate, and the Spanish moss could accidentally shade out its ostensible competitor, the ball moss. So they don't really cooperate in any way. They just like the same conditions. They can tolerate the same levels of pollution. So you're likely to see those two species in particular in town. Let's crash on. I don't want you to keep you for 2 hours again today. That was too much last week. We'll finish up with the ferns and some weirdos, some extras. The resurrection fern, as I mentioned before, the ferns represent some of the earliest of the land plants, and there was lots of bare territory when the first land plants were evolving. There was nothing else on land. Sooner or later, other plants evolved and came along. We got the conifers, we got the giant, like the giant horsetails and all that kind of thing. And eventually ferns figured out that they could send their spores up into this new real estate and become adopting an epiphytic lifestyle. Such is the rather modern, if as it were, species, the resurrection fern, Pleopeltis. This one's called resurrection because it's dealt with that water as a limiting factor by being able to completely desiccate. It dries out really fast, which seems counterintuitive when plants want to hang on to as much water as possible. This plant curls inside out, and all the little holes in the leaf are exposed to the air, so they dry out that much faster. The good news is, when it does rain, with all the little holes in the leaf on the underside of the leaf being exposed to the rain, they can fill up with water much faster, grow really fast, reproduce really quickly, and in between rains, curl up again, over and over and over throughout the rainy season. The golden-foot polypody, phlebodium, with its name that has the same root as the phlebotomist, the person who messes with your veins. This one has a very veiny leaf surface. Aureum means golden, so something about this plant is golden. You can see where the reproductive structures that produce the spores are located right here on the underside of these rather large and very deeply lobed leaves. What's golden are its feet. This is the stem of the golden-foot polypody, and it creeps and carries across the crevices of this sand live oak, this one in particular, being covered in these beautiful golden scales. They're protective scales. They're also absorptive. They can hold a lot of rainwater and make it available to the roots that come directly out of this creeping stem with its golden scales, and in particular, these little funny golden feet. The shoestring fern doesn't look like much of a fern at all. It looks like a shoestring, maybe. Just these green, very narrow green straps, Viteria. It's evergreen, giving it this Viteria, it lives all the time. Lineata, because the leaves are very long and linear, but it produces those crazy spores in the same little capsules as all other ferns, and that's what makes it a fern. This one we have very few of in this county, and the plants that we do have are kind of stunted. Again, environmental conditions are not perfect here. It might get a little bit too cold. It might get a little bit too dry. It's hanging on, the shoestring fern. Further south, especially in Mayaca, also a very good place to go and see the Tampa butterfly orchid and shoestring fern just dripping off the tree branches. A good place to see shoestring fern. Another one is Hillsborough River is a good place to go and visit the shoestring fern in person. That's it for the ferns, the epiphytic ferns in this part of Florida. We'll finish up with lichen. Now, these are that I mentioned earlier. They're the moss, and the fungus and the algae and the bacteria and the yeast and all these things put together. They'll grow on any surface. Just give a surface and the lichen will begin to grow. Historically, we're talking eons, the only real estate available would be tree trunks. And then man-made structures like buildings and fences and interpretive signs along your education center trails, lichen are pre-adapted to holding on to those. There's thousands of different kinds of lichen, and they grow in 3 different ways. Some grow as though they've been painted on whatever surface they're growing on. Those are referred to as the crustose type lichen. The Baton Rouge or Cryptothecia, the hidden body lichen, is a representative of the crustose type of lichen. The leafy lichens, technically referred to as foliose, these are ones that you're much more likely to see in town, downtown, in more urban areas. More of Pinellas, you're likely to see the foliose type lichens. They're very much more pollution adapted. They're not as sensitive, I should say. Parmelia is an example, one of the shield or the leafy lichen. The fruticose lichen, this one is actually called usnea, and we met usnea before. If you'll recall, the Tillandsia usneoides is the Spanish moss, the Tillandsia that looks like a beard. This is a lichen called usnea because it too looks like a beard, and it too has this very 3-dimensional growth habit where it can absorb all sorts of humidity and rainfall. The fungus is responsible for that, for providing the body structure. It gives all that water over to its captive photosynthetic cell mates, the bacteria or the algae that's producing all the sugar that the fungus then steals in order to grow the whole organism a little bit bigger. Crazy stuff, the lichen. And the British soldiers, another very charismatic lichen, maybe. I might be crazy. Anyway, the British soldiers, also called the matchstick lichen, very pre-adapted to growing on anything that's going to get it that much closer to the sun, that much closer to a breeze that's going to send the lichen propagules out into the environment so that the individual colony of organisms, fungus, bacteria, yeast, algae can reproduce itself. Mosses also represent those very early land plants. And so mosses had to figure out how to be on land. Mosses figured out how not to dry out and how to make use of rainwater. They had to figure out life outside of an aquatic ecosystem and a terrestrial ecosystem. So mosses represent the adaptations of those very first land plants. They don't have leaves, they don't have roots, they don't have anything to hang on with, but they still manage to occupy whatever surface they're given access to. Mosses also reproduce by spores. Those spores are single cells, so they're very aerodynamic, they're very light and can drift and can germinate and grow. And tree trunks are some real estate that mosses have adapted to grow on, and they've done very well. There's at least 2 species of moss represented here, these little kind of pipe cleaner shaped ones, and this one back here that looks more like a silver starfish, 2 different genera. This out of focus one in the foreground. These little capsules, those represent the spore capsules of the mosses. So these are the reproductive phase. You can see the little capsules down here as well. They're going to poof the spores out and hope they land on a separate tree so they don't have to try and compete with the plant that lost them. And finally, almost finally, finishing up with this group of plants, again, I'd probably get yelled at for calling the mosses and these liverworts epiphytes, but they are plants and they do grow on other plants and they do no harm to the plant that they grow on. But technically, these liverworts, they also represent those very, very, very first land plants. No flowers, spores at best for reproduction, just trying to go through a life cycle. Very, very small. The liverworts, there's this one that looks like the tree bark might just be cracking. Another one that's slightly more leafy. Getting a little obscure here, but it's fun staring at tree trunks for what could be growing on it. And finally, there are algae. There are plants, non-flowering plants, true plants that are free living, and they are the algae. And this one just happens to be kind of an orange colored algae. This is a non-aquatic algae species. This is Trentophilia. And Trentophilia is an algae, this species, that's very often found wrapped up, locked up in a lichen. So in order for an original lichen to form, a fungal spore will have to land very close to a colony of this free-living algae. That fungus will have to take it into captivity and then get it to work making sugar so the fungus can continue to grow and a new fungal organism can be established. All right, I promised I wouldn't keep you 2 hours. It's getting a little obscure. Let's just wrap up. I want to make these points just one more time, and then we'll take your questions and comments. Epiphytes, they have a common lifestyle. They're from several different groups of plants. We today looked at the bromeliads and the orchids and the ferns, probably the big three when it comes to epiphytes. They do no harm to the plant where they grow. That would be detrimental to themselves. So they do not harm their host. They're, as we mentioned, they come from flowering and non-flowering. We then got a little bit obscure and looked at some of the algae and liverworts and mosses and just crazy stuff. I mean, think about all the photosynthetic opportunities. They're born on the branches of an oak tree. If you add up all the Spanish moss, all the ball moss, all the other Tillandsia species, the true mosses, the lichens, the liverworts, all these things are photosynthetic. They're all producing oxygen. So the tree itself might actually be releasing less oxygen into the atmosphere than all of these things that live on the branches. So be nice to epiphytes. Don't let someone tell you that they're killing your plant. Leave them be. They're not doing any harm. If you got a problem with the tree and its growth it's actually growing backwards, it's dying for some other reason, yes, the epiphytic load could overwhelm it, but that's going to be curtains for everyone. Simply removing the Spanish moss isn't going to make that tree better again. There's something else at work that's causing the tree to decline. Removing the Spanish moss is only going to lighten your bank load for a short amount of time. The Spanish moss is going to be back. Wait a minute, I had a tree with Spanish moss on it and then it died. Didn't the Spanish moss kill it? No, the tree was dying. The Spanish moss was thriving. It was the tree's time. But wait, I paid somebody a lot of money to take Spanish moss off my tree. Well, you helped the local economy. There, you did a good thing. What you can do, leave them. I mean, if you're in a preserve, let's say you go to Mayaca, let's say you come to Brooker Creek and you see epiphytes on the ground and now you have a special place in your heart for epiphytes and you want to save them all, you can't. Just if they're on the ground, leave them there. I could almost be guilty in saying, wait a minute, that's just on the ground. It's just going to get covered up in leaves. It's just going to die. I think I'll give it a special life as an air plant at my house. No one will notice. It's just one of millions. Let me just take it to my house. Remember that weevil? Let's leave everything right where it is until we can figure out what we're doing with the weevil. It's just not a great idea to take stuff from preserves anyway. That's the golden rule. Again, there's no need to treat for Spanish moss or to treat for lichen. These are just taking advantage of some real estate that's been provided. And if you really want to help epiphytes, plant a tree. And if you really, really want to help epiphytes, plant a live oak far away from your house. The things get to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. So that's a great thing to do, is to plant a tree. I'm going to say thank you because I don't want to forget to say thank you. I'm going to remind you that we're coming back quite quickly, in fact, on June the 3rd with plant poison. 2 o'clock on June 3rd. Do drop me a note if I don't get to your question or if I don't give you a satisfactory answer this afternoon. But now I'm going to peek over here at some of the questions. Human uses. We talked about the fibers from Spanish moss. Hillsborough River State Park, Upper Tampa Bay. I'm not sure about Upper Tampa Bay as being a place to visit the shoestring fern. Personally, only seen it at Hillsborough River State. I think you can find that green fly orchid there as well. We're just a little bit out of the range of the green fly orchid here. What is the life of Spanish moss? Goodness, it's almost, Spanish moss is almost eternal. I know that sounds crazy because it continually gets longer and longer and longer. Now, the old plants towards the back might only live a year or two, but the growing tips can continue on almost indefinitely. And as I mentioned before, the front end can be broken off and put somewhere else, and that plant is just going to clone and continue to grow. Birds are quite good at moving Spanish moss from one place to another because they'll put it in their nest, and then the nest just starts to grow. What you see mostly in the trees, however, is the living Spanish moss. Once the Spanish moss, once the section or sections or the particular individual leaves, once their life is over and they've decomposed, all that's left is that little bit of fiber. And that tends to be recycled pretty quickly by organisms in the environment. So what you see in the trees are 99% living plants. Staghorn ferns are not native to Florida. They are an epiphytic fern. Good call. Unfortunately, staghorn ferns have been identified as an invasive plant in the not Okefenokee, what's the one? Everglades. Not a good one to I shouldn't have forgotten Everglades. Yes, staghorns, invasive, Everglades, which is sad. The red bugs, I think I saw something about that. Yes, about the red bugs in the Spanish moss. No, there's no reason for red bugs to live in Spanish moss. There's no way they could get to there's no way they could get to your blood. Red bugs live on the ground. They want you to step on them so they can grab your foot, or they want you to make a nest on the ground so when you go to sleep, they can come and find you. That's what red bugs do. They hang out on the ground. And people took the Spanish moss off the ground. It had red bugs as bycatch. Yeah. Moccasin Lake Nature Park over by the kapok tree. Thank you, Dolores. And I don't think we all need to go there right now, but in June, when the butterfly orchids are flowering, would be definitely worth. The air plants and climate change is an interesting question. I haven't heard any particular data about epiphytes in particular, but I wouldn't be surprised in the least if we began to see a diversity of species pushing further north, as we have seen with other organisms, especially insects, as latitudes become more and more accommodating to the temperature ranges of these different species, they're certainly going to occupy those temperature ranges. And I'm sure Spanish moss in particular will be one of the first that will be easily measured because it's such an obvious plant. We'll start seeing it perhaps becoming a perennial plant in North Carolina and Virginia that sort of thing, if it isn't already, but you know what I mean, further and further north. Right. So the question has to do with bromeliads that can live as a terrestrial plant with roots that anchor them to the soil. Would those pose a problem if you were to take one of the bromeliads that can and do grow as a terrestrial plant and put them up in the tree? They're still not going to harm that tree. They still represent an adaptation to living attached to something else. And a lot of our native bromeliads, the tillandsias that we saw, with the exception of the Spanish moss, the ones that form that little cistern, they can exist as a terrestrial plant for years and years and years. They just eventually may be shaded out by a layer of leaf litter. So the bromeliad with the red cup that collects the water, that's not going to harm your tree. It will eventually attach itself and not cause any problem. I know bromeliads and homeowners associations don't always get along. I grew up in Clearwater, and you know, my mom, very avid gardener. She always was trading plants and swapping plants, and our yard was just full of plants, and bromeliads were always something that people had extra of. That should be a warning. Anyway, she took them, put them base of a tree, and the next thing we knew, you know, just a few years went by, and the bromeliads that she had placed around the tree had begun climbing the tree because they could, and they were anxious to get as much surface area as they could. And lo and behold, mosquito control came around and scolded mom and told her that the bromeliads had to go. They were breeding mosquitoes. There wasn't any kind of control going on for mosquito control. And guess who got to remove all the bromeliads? And guess who discovered at a very young age that they're very often armored with spines along the leaf edges. Yeah. I don't even know why I brought that story up, but there you have it. Can you add epiphytes to your gardens? Sure, as long as they're ethically sourced, not wild collected, propagated, cloned. There's certainly lots of materials on how to successfully grow epiphytes. The only recommendation being not taking any from the wild. Just encourage the ones that might occur naturally in your own garden. Yeah, there you go with the mosquitoes. Frank had another excuse for removing the big bromeliads. And thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Oh, the red bug. This is funny. I mentioned red bugs, and there's a red bug that's associated with rain tree. It's the red bug that's associated with rain trees is called the Jadera beetle. Jadera. It only eats rain tree seeds. It doesn't do any harm. They're harmless to you unless you're a rain tree seed. All right, I think that's it. Have we? Thanks to Joan very much for keeping up with the Q&A. Really appreciate that. Appreciate all your questions, and I hope that you will join us next time. Anything to wrap up, Joan?
James, thank you so much. What great information on this really interesting and beautiful group of plants. And you do such a great job of making the information relatable to everybody. And we really appreciate that, as well as the sense of humor and all your great answers to the questions. Thanks for your time. Thank you everybody for joining us. I would say the next thing that you guys should do is make a treasure hunt out to Brooker Creek Preserve. or Weed Island Preserve or any of a number of the great parks and preserves we have in Pinellas County and find some of these guys out in the wild for yourselves. Thank you for letting us know what we should and should not do with the special epiphytes. And please come join us again where James is going to talk all about plant poison on June 3rd. All right. Until then, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again very soon. Bye.